I haven't felt alive in 4 years until you walked in. The forged report was still warm from the printer when I pushed through the glass doors of the executive boardroom on the 40th floor of Arden Tower. Nobody stops a woman who walks like she belongs somewhere. I had learned that trick years ago, back when I was still translating contracts for men who assumed an Omega interpreter was furniture with a vocabulary. So I walked in like I had been invited, like my name was already on the agenda, and I dropped 12 pages of falsified safety data onto the mahogany table in front of 11 shareholders and one alpha CEO who had never lost a negotiation in her life. "These numbers are lies," I said. Arden Global signed off on structural inspections that were never performed. If that warehouse floods again, it won't be a lawsuit, it will be a funeral. The silence afterward had weight. I felt it press against my ribs. Celeste Arden looked up from the head of the table slowly, the way a predator looks up when something smaller has wandered too close, curious before it decides whether to be angry. She was exactly what the business magazines promised. Sharp jaw, colder eyes, a voice that didn't need volume to command a room. 4 years of headlines had built her into something people whispered about, instead of spoke to directly. Ruthless. Untouchable. The alpha who fired her own brother's best friend without blinking. The alpha who had not taken a single mate claim meeting since her fiancé disappeared from every photograph the company ever released. "Who let this woman into my boardroom?" she said. Not a question. A verdict. "I don't work for you," I said. "I work for the translation firm your legal department hired to localize the contracts you signed with the dockworkers union. Which means I read every word of what you promised them. And I read every word of what you didn't deliver." Someone at the table cleared their throat like a warning. Celeste Arden did not blink. "Escort her out," she said, to no one and everyone at once, and 2 security officers were already moving toward me before she finished the sentence. I let them walk me to the elevator. I did not fight it, because fighting it in front of shareholders would have made the story about my behavior, instead of about a warehouse full of families who trusted a company that had lied to save money on inspection fees. I had learned patience was a weapon too, sometimes the sharpest one. But as the elevator doors closed, I caught Celeste Arden's eyes one last time across the boardroom, and for exactly 1 second, something flickered there that didn't belong to the woman the tabloids had built. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to recognition, like she had heard my voice somewhere before, and couldn't place where. I didn't know yet that 4 years of nothing was about to end because of me. I was 6 weeks behind on Ivy's after-school program fees, 3 days late on the electric bill, and entirely out of the kind of luck that pays rent. My niece was 6 years old, all gap teeth and stubborn opinions, and she was mine now, had been mine since my sister decided motherhood was a costume she didn't want to keep wearing, and left Ivy on my doorstep with a backpack and a note that said, "Take care of her better than I could." I did the math on the subway home that night, the way I did it every night. Freelance contract translation paid well when the jobs came, and starved me when they didn't. I had left my last full-time firm 2 years ago, after an alpha senior partner decided an unbonded Omega on his team was a liability waiting to happen. His words, in an exit interview I never asked for. Since then I had built something smaller, harder, mine. A single apartment 2 subway stops from Ivy's school, a refrigerator with exactly enough in it, a woman who had learned to stop expecting anyone to catch her when she fell, because nobody ever had. Ivy was waiting at the community center with her teacher, drawing a lopsided sun in purple crayon because she'd used up all the yellow. "Did you save the workers?" she asked, the second she saw me, because I had told her the shape of what I was doing that day without the ugly parts. "I tried," I said. "Trying counts," she said, with the total confidence of someone who had never once had trying not be enough, and I decided right then I would spend my whole life making sure that stayed true for her, even if it stopped being true for me a long time ago. That night I got the email. My contract with the translation firm had been terminated, effective immediately, citing unprofessional conduct in a client meeting. No severance, no appeal. I sat at my kitchen table with Ivy asleep in the next room, and did the math again, and this time the math didn't work no matter how I turned it. I told myself I would find something else. I always did. What I didn't tell myself, because I didn't know it yet, was that the alpha who fired me from that boardroom was, at that very moment, 3 floors below her own penthouse, standing frozen in front of a locked elevator, unable to breathe. I found out about the emergency job posting the way I found out about most things, through the community board at Ivy's after-school program, pinned beneath a flyer for a bake sale. Arden Tower needed an emergency translator for a delegation arriving from overseas the next morning, someone fluent enough to work without notice, available that night for prep. The pay was obscene, the irony was worse. I applied anyway, because obscene pay solves electric bills, and because some stubborn, prideful part of me wanted Celeste Arden to have to look at my name on a contract again. I didn't expect to be called in that same evening. I didn't expect the building to be running on emergency power because of a storm knocking out 3 blocks of the grid. And I certainly didn't expect to be standing in a service corridor on the 38th floor when the lights flickered, died, and the elevator ahead of me groaned to a stop between floors, with someone trapped inside it. I heard the sound first, not shouting, something quieter and far worse, the ragged, gasping rhythm of someone trying very hard not to fall apart and losing that argument in real time. "Hello?" I called through the doors. "Is someone in there?" A long pause, then barely audible, "Get away from the door." I recognized the voice before I understood why I recognized it. Cold, precise, cracked straight down the middle, like glass under pressure. Celeste Arden. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, and I sat down on the floor outside the elevator, my back against the wall, the way you sit down next to someone who is drowning even when you can't reach the water. "Talk to me instead. Tell me your name isn't Celeste Arden, because if it is, this is the strangest place I've ever run into my former employer." A broken, disbelieving sound came through the door. Not quite a laugh. "You're the interpreter. From the boardroom." "Talia," I said. "You fired the translation firm that fired me an hour after I embarrassed you in front of your shareholders, so I think we're even." "I didn't fire you," she said, voice tight, breath coming faster. "I ordered an investigation into the report. Your firm made its own decision about you." "Feels the same from where I'm sitting. Everything feels the same right now," she said, and something in her tone broke open, small and involuntary, the kind of honesty that only comes out of people when they think they're about to die and have stopped caring what it costs them to be truthful. "I can't. The walls are. I don't have room to." "Hey." I pressed my palm flat against the cold metal door, an instinct more than a plan. "Listen to my voice, not the walls. You don't have to fight the panic. You just have to survive the next 10 seconds. Then the 10 after that. That's all this is. 10 seconds at a time." "How do you know that?" "Because I've had my own 10 seconds, I said, which was true, and which I had never said out loud to anyone who wasn't Ivy. "Breathe in through your nose for 4 counts. I'll count with you." I counted. She breathed, ragged at first, then less ragged. I kept talking, about nothing, about everything, about the terrible instant coffee in the break room 3 floors up, about how storms in this city always made the power grid behave like a toddler having a tantrum, about anything that wasn't the 4 walls closing in on a woman the world thought was made of steel. 20 minutes later, when emergency power kicked the elevator back to life, and the doors finally opened, Celeste Arden stepped out pale, shaking faintly, hair coming loose from its severe knot, looking nothing like the alpha who had ordered me out of her boardroom that afternoon. She looked at me like she was trying to solve an equation. "Why did you stay?" she said. "Because nobody should have to survive that alone," I said. "Not even you." She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything else at all. She just watched me walk away down the corridor, and I felt her eyes on my back the entire length of it, the way you feel weather changing before the first drop of rain. I didn't hear from Arden Tower again for 4 days. I assumed that was the end of it. A strange, private moment neither of us would ever mention again, the kind of thing you file away and never open. I picked up 2 smaller translation contracts to cover the gap, walked Ivy to school, walked her back, and told myself the flutter in my chest every time I thought about a locked elevator was nothing. Adrenaline. Nothing more. Then the night transport service I used to get home from late client meetings, the cheap one, the one with the driver who ran red lights and smelled like he'd been drinking since noon, canceled on me without explanation. In its place, a black car with tinted windows, and a driver who introduced himself politely and said the fare had already been paid, indefinitely, by an account listed only as AC. I called the number on the confirmation email. A clipped assistant informed me that Miss Arden had noted my previous transport service had 3 safety violations on public record and had arranged an alternative. No further explanation was offered. None was apparently required. I told myself I was angry about it. I told myself for 3 days, right up until the afternoon I picked Ivy up from school and found, taped inside my mailbox, a small professionally framed print of a drawing I recognized instantly, the lopsided purple sun Ivy had made at the community center the night I lost my job. I had left the original behind there, in the rush to get Ivy home. I had no idea how anyone else had ever seen it. "Someone likes my son," Ivy said, delighted, tracing the frame with one finger. I did not tell her that someone was the most feared alpha CEO in the city, and that I had absolutely no idea what to do with the fact that she had apparently gone looking for a 6-year-old's crumpled drawing and decided it deserved glass and a frame. I confronted her about it, the only way I knew how to confront anyone, directly, in person, uninvited. I walked into Arden Tower's lobby, gave my name, and told the receptionist I needed 5 minutes with Ms. Arden regarding an unauthorized transport account and an unauthorized frame. She saw me within 10 minutes. Her office was colder than I expected, and warmer than the reputation suggested, all glass and steel except for one shelf, low and half-hidden behind a stack of quarterly reports, where I could just make out a familiar scrap of purple crayon sun sitting in a second frame, a duplicate, tucked where no board member would ever see it. "You have questions," she said, before I could speak, arms crossed, posture braced like she expected an attack. "I have several," I said, starting with why the most powerful woman in this city is stealing my niece's homework. It wasn't stolen. The community center throws away artwork at the end of each month. I asked before I took it. That's not less strange. That's more strange. Something almost like a smile moved across her mouth and disappeared before it could fully arrive. "I set the transport account up because I looked into the company you were using," she said. "2 assault reports on drivers in the last year. You can cancel the account if you want, but I needed you to know what I found. You investigated my ride service without asking me." Yes. Her jaw tightened. That part was over the line. "I won't make choices for you, Talia. But I won't see danger and pretend I didn't. I learned that lesson already. I'm not learning it twice." I didn't know then what she meant. I would find out soon enough. The shape of a wound 4 years old, cut so deep it had rearranged everything around it, including a woman who had once, apparently, known how to trust someone. I stood in her office a moment longer than I should have, close enough to catch her scent for the first time without the noise of a boardroom or a storm between us. Something like cedar and rain on stone, steady in a way that had no business steadying me. Celeste Arden was not supposed to be someone whose presence made the air easier to breathe. She was supposed to be the alpha who had my contract terminated with one signature. And yet, "I don't need saving," I told her. because it felt important to say it before whatever was happening between us went any further. "I know," she said. "I'm not trying to save you. I'm trying to remember what it feels like to want to." I left her office without an answer to that, because I didn't have one, and because some sentences deserve to sit in the air unanswered for a while before you're brave enough to go back and pick them up. It became a pattern neither of us named out loud. Small, deniable gestures. A translation contract that landed in my inbox from a subsidiary of Arden Global, paying triple market rate, that I only accepted after confirming 3 times it wasn't charity. A standing reservation at the coffee shop near Ivy's school that somehow always had my order ready before I asked, paid for on an account I never set up. Once, arriving to pick Ivy up early from a fever, I found Celeste Arden's black car idling outside the school. Not her inside it, just the car, sent because I had mentioned once, in passing, that Ivy's fevers made her too weak to walk the 4 blocks home. I started keeping her voicemails. She would call sometimes late at night, always with some flimsy professional pretext, a clarification on a translated clause, a question about union terminology, and I would answer, and the pretext would dissolve within 2 minutes into something closer to conversation, low and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had apparently forgotten how good it felt to talk to someone who didn't want anything from her. I told myself I kept the recordings for professional reference. I played them back more than professional reference required. "You don't talk like the woman from the boardroom," I told her once, curled on my couch with Ivy long asleep in the next room, phone pressed to my ear like a teenager. "The woman from the boardroom is armor," Celeste said. "This is what's underneath it. I haven't shown anyone the underneath in 4 years. Why me?" There was a long pause, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Because you didn't run from a locked door," she said finally. "Everyone else in my life has run from something. Eventually. You didn't even know me, and you sat down on the floor next to a stranger's fear, like it was the easiest decision you'd ever made." "It was the easiest decision I'd ever made," I said, and meant it. "I learned about the 4 years the way you learn about a wound someone has spent a long time hiding. Not all at once, but in pieces, offered when the person finally trusts you enough to stop flinching away from their own history." It came out fully one night in her penthouse, the first time she'd invited me somewhere that wasn't neutral ground, wine untouched on the table between us because neither of us particularly wanted it. We wanted the conversation instead. "Her name was Renata," Celeste said, staring at the skyline instead of at me, the city lights turning her face into something carved rather than lived in. "We were engaged. Everyone in this industry knew it. My father built half his legacy on the idea that the Arden name would merge with the Voss shipping empire, and I let myself believe that meant something more than a contract, because I loved her, and I was young enough and stupid enough to think love and contracts could be the same document. What happened? She was never planning to marry me. She was buying time until a better offer came along, a merger with a competitor that would have gutted half my board and put her name on the building instead of mine. I found out 3 days before the wedding, from an intern who'd overheard a phone call she wasn't careful enough to hide. I confronted her in this apartment. She didn't even deny it. She told me love was inefficient, and she'd rather be efficient. Celeste's jaw tightened, the muscle working under skin gone pale. I fired her from every position her family held stock influence over. I rebuilt the board so no one could ever leverage my personal life against my company again, and I made a decision, standing in this exact spot, that I would never again let anyone close enough to know which walls to knock down. 4 years, I said quietly. 4 years, she confirmed. Until an interpreter walked into my boardroom and told me the truth to my face when everyone else in that building has spent a decade telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. She finally looked at me, something unguarded in her eyes that I understood now had cost her enormously to let show. "I haven't felt anything in 4 years, Talia. Not really. Not until you." I reached for her hand across the space between us, and she let me take it, her fingers cold and then not cold, and I understood in that moment that the alpha the tabloids called Ruthless had spent 4 years building a fortress so no one could ever again find the door, and I had somehow, without meaning to, found it anyway. I did not expect Renata Voss to walk back into either of our lives 8 weeks later. I certainly did not expect her to walk back in wearing a guest badge from Arden Global's own security desk, smiling like a woman who had never once been anyone's betrayal. Arden Global was still tied to Voss interests through 2 inherited consulting agreements Celeste had never bothered to unwind. One of them was apparently enough to get Renata through security. I was in the executive floor's small conference room, finalizing translated terms for a new dockworkers contract. Legitimate work now. Work I was proud of. Work that had nothing to do with the woman I had started, cautiously, carefully, to build a life alongside. Renata found me there alone. "You're the interpreter," she said, looking me over the way people look over furniture they're deciding whether to buy. Celeste's new distraction. How quaint, an unbonded Omega playing house with a wounded Alpha's guilt. "I'm not playing anything." "No," Renata agreed, too easily. "I don't think you are, which makes this so much simpler." I didn't understand what she meant until 3 days later, when Arden Global's internal security flagged an anonymous data breach traced to a device registered under my employee credentials I hadn't even known I had, issued as part of my subsidiary contract without my direct knowledge. Credentials someone with intimate access to the system had clearly used to frame me while I sat in a conference room translating union clauses in good faith. I was escorted from the building. Again, this time by security who wouldn't meet my eyes, this time with an accusation of corporate espionage instead of unprofessional conduct. This time with Celeste Arden standing at the far end of the hallway, her face a mask I hadn't seen since the boardroom. Unreadable, closed, cold in a way that felt like 4 years of trauma reasserting itself all at once. "You need to explain this," she said, voice flat, and I understood in that instant that trust, once broken, apparently didn't ask for evidence before it collapsed. It just collapsed. "I didn't do this," I said. "Celeste, look at me. I didn't do this." The breach traces to your credentials. The timing traces to Renata's arrival. I don't know what to believe. "Then believe me," I said, and heard how small it sounded against 4 years of a wound that had taught her the exact opposite lesson. She didn't answer. She turned and walked back into her office, and the door closed with a sound that felt, in that hallway, exactly like the elevator doors closing on me the first day we met, except this time, no one sat down on the floor outside to wait for me to breathe through it. I went home that night and told myself I wouldn't cry in front of Ivy, and mostly kept that promise, and lay awake instead replaying every gesture Celeste had ever made, the frame, the driver, the coffee order, the voicemails, and wondering if trust that could be undone this easily by an accusation had ever really been trust at all, or just the temporary absence of fear. I made the decision 2 days later, sitting across from Celeste's assistant, instead of Celeste herself, because Celeste hadn't returned a single call. I terminated my subsidiary contract in writing. I told the assistant to inform Miss Arden that I would not be pursuing legal action over the false accusation, and that I would also not be returning to any position, personal or professional, that required me to prove my innocence to someone who hadn't bothered to ask for it directly. "I don't want to be an employee she can dismiss, or a liability she has to manage," I told the assistant, who had the decency to look uncomfortable relaying the message. "Tell her I said that exactly." I didn't hear back. Not that day, not the next, not for 11 days after, during which I rebuilt my freelance client list from scratch, walked Ivy to school every morning with a steadiness I did not feel, and tried very hard not to check my phone for a voicemail that never came. What I didn't know, what I only learned much later, pieced together from a security officer who eventually testified to it, was that Celeste had spent every one of those 11 days doing the one thing she had apparently never let herself do for anyone before. She was fighting for me, silently, without telling me, because some old, broken part of her still believed that love asking for anything in return was a weakness Renata had already punished her for once. She hired an independent forensic auditor the same night I was escorted out, over her own legal team's objections, because her legal team wanted a quiet internal resolution, and Celeste wanted the truth, even if the truth was expensive and slow. The auditor found what any careful investigator would eventually find: device logs that placed the actual breach on hardware, registered to a guest badge issued the same week to Renata Voss, timestamps that made a mockery of the anonymous accusation, a digital trail Renata hadn't bothered to cover because she had never expected anyone to look past the convenient scapegoat standing right in front of them. Celeste fired Renata's access permanently, this time from every consulting contract Arden Global had ever extended her, severed the last professional thread connecting their names, and then did something the old Celeste, the one who had rebuilt an entire board to protect herself from ever being vulnerable again, would never have done. She went looking for me, not through an assistant, not through a driver, or a contract, or a framed drawing left in a mailbox. In person, in the storm that had started rolling over the city that evening, up to the one place she knew I sometimes went when I needed air, and Ivy was safely asleep at my neighbor's. The rooftop garden 2 blocks from my apartment, the one with the crooked bench and the string lights that never quite worked right. I was standing at the railing when I heard the helipad door on the far side of the building bang open against the wind, and I turned, and Celeste Arden was standing there soaked to the skin, hair plastered flat, no assistant, no driver, no armor at all, looking like every version of the woman I had come to know stripped down to the single truest one underneath. "I haven't felt alive in 4 years," she roared, the words ripping through the rain and the wind and every wall either of us had ever built. "Until you walked in. What have you done to me?" I didn't move. I couldn't. The rain came down between us, like something trying to decide whose side it was on. "You accused me," I said, because it needed saying before anything else could be said. "You looked at me in that hallway, and you believed a stranger over me in less time than it took her to say my name." I know. She didn't defend it. She didn't reach for an excuse. I spent 4 years building a version of myself that survives by trusting no one, and for 11 days I let that version keep me silent, while I searched for proof of what I should have trusted you enough to believe. Some part of me was terrified that if I trusted you completely, and you left anyway, it would break something in me that never grows back. I was wrong. I was wrong the moment I let fear speak louder than what I actually knew about you. She took a step closer, close enough now that I could see the rain running down the line of her jaw, close enough to smell cedar and rain-soaked stone underneath the storm. "I found the truth, Talia. I fired her from every last thread connecting her to my company, and I understand if that's 11 days too late. But I am not walking away from this rooftop without telling you that you are the only thing in 4 years that has made me feel like the walls weren't closing in. You don't get to say things like that and expect me to just—" "I don't expect anything," she said. "I'm not here to be forgiven. I'm here because staying silent about what I feel is exactly the thing that cost me everything the last time, and I refuse to make that mistake with you." Ivy's son is still on my shelf. It's the only piece of art in that entire office that isn't there, because a decorator chose it. I look at it every single day and think about a woman who sat down on a cold floor next to a stranger's panic attack, because nobody should have to survive that alone. I want to be the kind of alpha who deserves that woman. I am asking you to let me try. The rain didn't stop. Neither of us moved to get out of it. I stood there with 4 years of someone else's trauma, and 11 days of my own hurt laid bare on a rooftop between us, and I made the only choice that had ever actually felt like mine to make. I crossed the distance and kissed her, storm and all, and felt 4 years of careful armor finally, completely, come undone. The trust didn't rebuild itself in a single storm-soaked kiss, no matter how much either of us might have wanted the story to be that simple. Trust, I was learning, wasn't a door that opened once and stayed open. It was 100 small doors, opened again and again, every day, on purpose. We built those days slowly, deliberately, the way you rebuild anything worth keeping. Celeste came to Ivy's school recital, sitting in a folding chair 3 sizes too small for someone who ran a company worth more than the school's entire district budget, clapping so hard for a 6-year-old's off-key rendition of a song about a son that I had to look away so she wouldn't see me cry. Ivy, for her part, decided within a month that Celeste's severe, careful reserve was simply a puzzle to be solved, and set about solving it with the total, fearless persistence only a 6-year-old possesses. "You don't smile with your teeth," Ivy informed her solemnly one evening, over a dinner Celeste had nervously, badly attempted to cook herself, instead of having catered, because she'd overheard me mention once that Ivy loved watching people cook. "Only with your mouth a little bit. Are you scared of your teeth?" "I'm scared of a great many things," Celeste said, with a seriousness that somehow made Ivy laugh instead of worry. "But not my teeth. Would you like to see them?" And she bared her teeth in an exaggerated, ridiculous grin, and Ivy shrieked with delight, and I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen, watching the most feared alpha CEO in the city make faces at a 6-year-old, and understood that whatever this was, it had stopped being careful and cautious somewhere along the way, and become something closer to home. Celeste told me, months later, that Ivy's drawing had become the reason she survived the worst weeks of the fallout with Renata's public smear campaign, the one Renata launched out of spite once she realized her frame job had failed, feeding tabloids a story about the ruthless alpha CEO and her secretly manipulative Omega interpreter, trying one last time to make the narrative about weakness instead of about her own betrayal. Celeste didn't flinch from it the way the old Celeste would have, didn't scrub my name from every record, didn't distance herself to protect the company's image the way 4 years of trauma had trained her to. She held a press conference instead, stood in front of the same boardroom I had once stormed into carrying proof of falsified safety reports, and told the truth without apology. "Talia Reid exposed a safety fraud that could have killed union workers in this city," she said, her voice carrying the same authority it had the day she'd had me thrown out, except now it was pointed in the opposite direction entirely. "She is the reason those inspections were actually completed. She is the reason I am, for the first time in 4 years, capable of standing in front of you as someone who trusts another person completely. If that story is inconvenient for anyone in this industry, it is not going to change, because it is true." I watched the footage later from my kitchen table, Ivy asleep against my shoulder, and felt something in my chest ease that had been braced tight since the day I lost my first job for telling the truth in a room that didn't want to hear it. It would have made a tidy ending, if endings in real life ever arrived tidy. Renata tried once more with a baseless wrongful termination lawsuit, but the same forensic audit that had cleared me dismantled her case, and her credentials on the compromised device finished what the storm never could. The case was dismissed. Sitting beside Celeste in that painfully ordinary room, her hand steady around mine beneath the table, I understood where the real ending lived, not in the rooftop confession, but in 2 people still choosing to stand next to each other when there was no audience left to impress. The bonding, when it finally happened, was nothing like the tabloids would have imagined for the city's most notorious alpha. No grand gala, no boardroom announcement, no press release. Just the 3 of us, because it had always been the 3 of us, whether either adult had admitted it out loud yet, in the small rooftop garden with the crooked bench and the string lights, which Celeste had quietly had repaired without ever mentioning it, the same lights that had watched the storm the night everything changed. Ivy insisted on being the one to hand over the bonding cord because she had appointed herself, with total 6-year-old authority, the official supervisor of the entire relationship from the very beginning. "You have to be nice to her forever," she told Celeste solemnly, holding the cord just out of reach until she'd extracted the promise she wanted. "Not just when people are watching." "I promise," Celeste said. And there wasn't a trace of the boardroom in her voice at all. Nothing performed, nothing armored. Just a woman who had spent 4 years believing she would never again say those words, and mean them, finally saying them anyway. I felt the bond settle between us like something that had always belonged there, waiting patiently under 4 years of scar tissue for someone brave enough, or perhaps simply stubborn enough, to find it. Later, much later, on an ordinary evening with no storm and no headline and no boardroom in sight, I sat curled against Celeste on the couch in the apartment we'd finally decided, together, to call ours. The one with Ivy's drawings taped crookedly across an entire wall Celeste refused to let an interior decorator touch. And I asked her, half teasing, whether she remembered exactly what she'd said to me on that rooftop, word for word. She was quiet for a moment, tracing slow, absent circles against my shoulder, the way she did now without noticing she was doing it. "I haven't felt alive in 4 years," she said softly. "No storm to shout it over this time, no rain to hide behind, just the low hum of an ordinary night and a 6-year-old's laughter drifting faintly from the next room. Until you walked in." I didn't need her to roar it this time, said quietly, in a home neither of us had believed we'd ever get to have. It meant more than it ever had on that rooftop. "If a love story like Talia and Celeste's found its way into your heart tonight, stay close. The next chapter is already waiting for you."